Hey YouTube, so I wanted to talk a little bit about skepticism. I know, skepticism again. Well, I have a video on a completely different topic coming out quite soon, so it's not all going to be skepticism, but I did just want to say a little bit about skepticism, and it's something that I've kind of mentioned a little bit in recent videos, but I just wanted to elaborate on this idea. So, in contemporary philosophy, skepticism is framed almost exclusively in terms of it's framed as a claim about knowledge or justification. So the skeptic is taken to be asserting that we do not know many of the things that we ordinarily claim to know. Most of our ordinary knowledge claims are false, or she's taken to be saying that we are not justified in believing many of the things we ordinarily take ourselves to be justified in believing. So classic example, of course, is a proposition, I know that I have hands, right? The skeptic is going to argue against that. No, you do not know that you have hands. So standard skeptical argument would proceed by appealing to, say, a skeptical hypothesis, like the brain in the vat hypothesis. And the argument goes, if you do not know that you are not a brain in a vat, then you do not know that you have hands. You do not know that you're not a brain in a vat, so you don't know that you have hands. Right? The fact that I cannot rule out the brain in a vat hypothesis, the fact that all of my experiences are completely consistent with my being a brain in a vat, that is taken to show that it is not appropriate to claim to know that I have hands. Right? The term knowledge does not correctly apply to the proposition that I have hands. So, as I said, this is how skepticism is generally presented, I think, in modern philosophy. But I want to suggest a different way of thinking about skepticism, because I think that the way that we present it, when we present it in terms of like knowledge and justification, is useful for all sorts of reasons. But it is liable to be a little bit misleading, and I think that the real spirit of skepticism is something a bit different. So to me, the spirit of skepticism isn't necessarily anything to do with claims about knowledge or justification. It's more about a kind of fairly deep doubt or distrust or not taking something too seriously, and this doesn't necessarily have to have anything to do with knowledge. So the point, as I see it, is so what the skeptic is driving at is they're trying to push you to doubt, distrust, not take too seriously the claim that you have hands. And whether you sort of say that you know that you have hands is a little bit of a tangent to that. So I think one way to sort of see this different way of thinking about skepticism is to consider one of the popular responses to skepticism, externalism. So, according to externalists, whether a person's belief is justified depends on factors that are external to that person. So the simplest kind of externalism would be some sort of reliabilism, right? Where a reliabilist is going to say, okay, in order for you to know that some proposition is true, you need to have a true belief in that proposition, where that true belief was produced by a reliable process. And a reliable process is a process that tends to produce a good proportion of true beliefs over false beliefs. So if you take, for instance, the claim, I have hands, right? The reliabilist will say, yeah, right, I do know that I have hands, and the reason why I know that I have hands is that this is a belief which is true, and this belief has been produced by the process of visual perception, and visual perception is generally reliable. Visual perception generally delivers true beliefs. Now, so the key thing here is that the reliability of that process, the reliability of visual perception, is not something that I need to have any awareness of. The reliability is just an objective fact it's independent of, or at least it's not necessarily like part of my own internal experience. So I don't need to know that visual perception is reliable in order to know that I have hands, in order to know things on the basis of visual perception. So if you take me and my brain in a vat twin, you take a brain that's exactly identical to my brain, but that happens to be in a vat. Well, presumably, arguably, these brains are going to have the same mental states, so the internal experience will be exactly the same. Let's just grant that for the sake of illustrating this point. So grant that the internal states are exactly the same. What the reliabilist will say is, my beliefs are justified, but my brain in a vat twin's beliefs are not justified. And the reason is just, my beliefs are in fact produced by this reliable process. My brain in a vat twin's beliefs are not produced by a reliable process. So the key thing then is that to know that P does not require ruling out hypotheses that are inconsistent with P. I can know that I have hands, even if I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat. Because it's like, my internal experience is just as it would be if I were a brain in a vat. But the thing is, that just doesn't matter. I don't need to know that I'm not a brain in a vat to know that I have hands. All that matters is that it is in fact true that I have hands, and that belief was produced by a reliable process. Now, many people have the intuition that externalism just misses the point in some way. That externalism is maybe in some deep way maybe question begging, or it just sort of doesn't kind of get what the skeptic is driving at. And I think there is something to this intuition. I have a video on externalist responses to skepticism where I try to elaborate various different ways of making that intuition a bit more precise. But I think that, if you take this view of skepticism that I have suggested, where skepticism is not necessarily a claim about the proper application conditions of the term knowledge, right, but is instead a claim about, it's instead like trying to push you to deeply doubt, to distrust, to stop taking certain things seriously. And in that way of thinking about skepticism, it just is kind of obvious that externalism is just powerless, because externalism does nothing to resolve the doubt. Like, sure, if I presuppose a whole bunch of stuff about the external world, and then I adopt a reliabilist account of knowledge, then I can indeed reject one of the premises of that classic skeptical argument, right? I can reject the premise that says, if you don't know that you're not a brain in a vat, you don't know that you have hands. So that's all well and good, right? But how does that help me if as a result of thinking about these skeptical scenarios, I have been put into a state of doubt? Because if I'm in a state of doubt about whether there is anything, whether things are as they appear to be, then I'm also going to be in a state of doubt about whether visual perception is in fact a reliable process. I'm going to be in a state of doubt about whether visual perception does indeed deliver a high proportion of true beliefs over false beliefs. So, it's like, it's given the kind of like point of view that the externalist has, sure, you can adopt that account of knowledge, and you can reject the premise of the skeptical argument, you can resist the argument, that's all fine, but it just doesn't really seem to help at all with the doubt, right? So, the way that this generally works, I think, the way that skepticism tends to have some sort of compelling power over people is you start reflecting on, okay, there's a whole bunch of different scenarios where my experiences would be just as they are. One of those scenarios is the kind of common sense scenario where, I'm living in a world populated by all of these ordinary objects, and I have things like hands, and I'm in a room, and, there are cars and trees and fields and all that stuff, and there's other people, and etc., etc. But there's also, the brain in the vat, and the evil demon, and the simulation, and blah, 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 whatever it may be. There's a whole bunch of other options. And it doesn't seem like I have any way of ruling them. I got nothing. I can't have any way of ruling them out. I'm just not sure. So I'm in a state of doubt. How do I get out of that? It doesn't look like externalism is going to help me at all. Doesn't help me if I already doubt. And just to say that, I have a view of knowledge that allows me, it's like, well, look, as long as your visual perception is in fact reliable, as long as there is in fact an external world and the world is as it seems to be, then you do know that you have hands. It's like, yeah, so what? I don't need to rule out the evil demon hypothesis in order to know that there's an external world. It's like, yeah, maybe I do have knowledge then. So what? I'm still in a state of doubt. So many skeptical arguments, as I say, they're framed in terms of knowledge, and it's almost presented as though the debate is about the proper application conditions of the term knowledge. But I think that's kind of, again, it's kind of missing the point. Skeptical arguments don't need to be framed that way. Indeed, I think really they don't need to be framed necessarily as arguments at all. At least not in the sense that they are, sets of propositions that lead to some other proposition. I mean, you can instead just ask a question. You can say, why should I trust this? Why trust this? So, like, you're giving me, you're saying certain things about the world. You're saying that there are people and cars and fields and trees and hands. Why should I trust that? I'm reflecting on all of the different ways in which my experiences might have come about. I'm reflecting that what you're saying about the world is just one among many ways that my experiences might come about. So why the hell should I trust that? Indeed, just as a sort of general metaphilosophical point, it's not entirely obvious to me that philosophy, just in general, has to be about like propositional arguments primarily. I mean, the point of an argument is to, in some way, fix or influence your beliefs. You like the question that we start with is, what should I believe? What should I think about what's going on? And arguments are an important way to figure out what's going on. But they're only one way. Arguments can induce doubt or they can resolve doubt, but they're only one way of doing that. And you don't need some propositional argument to induce doubt, or necessarily to resolve it, for that matter. I mean, let's say, for instance, that I'm at like a car dealership, and I get the sense that somebody is scamming me, right? I'm like, wait a minute, I'm not sure that this person is legitimate. I have this worry. I just sort of start to get this worry that maybe there might be some underhanded stuff going on. I may not have arrived at that worry by formulating an argument which ends with the conclusion, I am being scammed, right? But, still I have this worry. And of course, in that situation, I don't think it's going to be even remotely comforting to be told, well, look, it is in fact true that you're not being scammed, and the belief that you're not being scammed is the product of a reliable process that tends to produce true beliefs over false beliefs. So you know that you're not being scammed. Yeah, you don't worry about it. You just go away and ignore it. Or maybe, to give a more sort of philosophically relevant example, let's say that I believe in God. I've spent my whole life going to church, and everything's organized around God. Everybody in my community talks about God. Maybe I sort of have some view about how it is that we form correct beliefs about God. Maybe I think, look, God created us, and because he's the creator, he installed in us a certain capacity of recognizing the divine in things, etc., etc. But then I encounter some people who just don't believe in God, and I notice that their theory looks like it's also entirely consistent with all of these experiences I'm having. And so I start to wonder, like, wait, is God real? Is it going to be any comfort to be told that, well, look, you have a true belief that there's God, and that true belief has in fact been produced by a reliable process, because God is not a deceiver, right? God has made you with this capacity for recognizing him, and that tends to produce true beliefs over false beliefs. It's powerless, I think, powerless to deal with the doubt that is induced by encountering these other worldviews. And the encounter with those other worldviews, again, is not necessarily a propositional argument, and it's not necessarily about whether you have knowledge. So I think the basic challenge of skepticism it's not about whether you have knowledge per some technical concept of knowledge. The challenge is, why should I trust this, right? So I've realized that, okay, there's these challenges to my beliefs in some way. And so now I wonder, why should I trust them? Why? Why do that? And no, it doesn't seem to me, just as a matter of, like, in principle, it doesn't seem to me that any argument about the concept of knowledge or the concept of justification, or, I just don't see how that's going to do how that kind of argument is going to do anything to resolve that doubt, because, it's like, you can have an absolutely watertight argument that, we have this concept of knowledge, and the application conditions for that concept of knowledge means that concept does correctly apply to certain people in certain circumstances. Okay, so what? I mean, that's just because the question from my point of view is, well, how do I, why should I trust that I'm in those circumstances? Now, of course, it's true that we sometimes express doubt or distrust using the language of knowledge, using these sort of knowledge terms. So let's say you show me a study that, I don't know, red meat causes cancer, right? And I look at it and I doubt its methodological credentials. And I may well say, well, you don't know that that's true. You don't know that red meat causes cancer. But, there's other ways that I could express the point, and I don't think we should base our whole epistemology on these sort of turns of phrase. Actually, if you've been paying attention to me as I've been talking about this, you might notice that as much as I started out by saying, look, maybe we shouldn't think of skepticism in terms of knowledge, but I've had to be very careful and watch my own language, because I have occasionally been tempted to say, well, how do I know that, I have hands? Because it's just like a common way of speaking. But it's like, okay, don't get too fixated on just, the way that we happen to use the English language here, right? When I say I don't know that I have hands, right, what I'm really expressing is something about, doubt, distrust, and again, saying, well, look, you do know that you have hands because, I have a watertight argument for a concept of knowledge which entails that, knowledge applies just in case there are hands, and then your visual perception is hooked up to them in the right way. It's just irrelevant. It seems to me to be completely beside the point. I want to approach this from a slightly different angle, actually, because I think that it's not just arguments against skepticism that can miss the point. There are some arguments for skepticism that I think miss the point in a very similar way. They kind of miss the spirit of skepticism. So I'm thinking in particular of some arguments for skepticism that have been proposed by Peter Unger. So Peter Unger, he kind of targets our concept of knowledge, and in particular he says that knowledge is an absolute term. So to understand this, take the term flat, right? According to Unger, flat means not bumpy. And so when I say, like, the table is flat, I'm saying the table is not bumpy. I'm saying that the property that the word bumpy purports to denote is not present. But the thing is this: that property is present. I mean, it clearly is. If you look at a table, if you look at it close enough, you're going to find all kinds of, bumps on it. In fact, there are probably no macroscopic physical objects for which it is true that the property that bumpy purports to denote is not present. And so what this means is that the term flat does not correctly apply to anything in the physical world, or at least none of the macroscopic objects in the physical world. None of the objects that we interact with in our everyday lives are actually flat. And so the key thing here is what it means to say that flat is an absolute term is that the term flat will not correctly apply to anything if there's even the slightest bump, right? If bumpiness is present to even if there's even the tiniest little bump on something, then it's not going to be true that thing is flat. Because flat rules out bumpiness, period. So any tiny amount of bumps, that means that something is not flat, according to Unger. But of course, we talk about things as if they're flat, and what's going on here is, well, it's just an approximation, or maybe an idealization. It's useful for us to talk about certain things as if they are flat. It's useful for us to act as if things are flat, even though, if we were to like actually look at them more carefully, we would see that they are not flat. In everyday situations, we speak loosely and casually. We say many things that, strictly speaking, are false, but we act as if they are true. And so, for Unger, whenever we say that any macroscopic object is flat, that's what we're doing, right? Okay, so what does this have to do with knowledge? Well, knowledge, according to Unger, is also an absolute term. And what he argues basically is knowledge requires certainty. So to say that I know that P, it's only going to be appropriate for me to say that if I can claim to be certain that P. But certainty requires the complete elimination of any doubt whatsoever, right? So to say that I am certain that P means I have no doubt whatsoever about P. It is that there is just no possibility that I might be wrong about P. And the problem is that there's always, like, everybody recognizes that for pretty much anything I say, there's going to be the possibility that I'm mistaken, right? I can never completely eliminate doubt. Maybe there are some propositions for which you think that you can completely eliminate doubt. Maybe you think you just have no doubt whatsoever about 1 + 1 = 2 or something. But like when it comes to the claim that you have hands, I think the vast majority of people would probably just accept that, it's possible. There is going to be some possibility that you might be wrong. Even people who reject skepticism will acknowledge that there's like a possibility that I'm mistaken. It's like, sure, maybe the brain in the vat scenario or the evil demon scenario, like, yeah, that's at least it's possible. So it tends to be quite rare for people to actually think that they have achieved total certainty about something, 100% certainty. So the idea is this: knowledge requires certainty, but to say that it is certain that P, these are absolute terms, right? There cannot be even the slightest sliver of the possibility that you are wrong, the slightest doubt. So what that means is we have no knowledge. So there you go. You get skepticism. You do not know that you have hands. And the reason why you do not know that you have hands is that in order to know that you have hands, you would have to completely eliminate any possibility of being mistaken, but you can't do that. Now, this is technically an argument for skepticism. I mean, it's an argument for the claim that we do not know that we have hands. But there's something about this that just seems to not really be skepticism. Like, I look at this argument and I just sort of feel kind of completely unmoved by it in terms of like what the skeptic seems to be getting at. This argument, it's like, well, maybe this is telling us something interesting about the English language term know. Maybe it's telling us something interesting about the concept of knowledge. But does this really have anything to do with skepticism? I mean, I think the problem is that even if this shows that I do not know that I have hands, it doesn't actually do anything to undermine my trust that I have hands. It doesn't do anything to induce doubt that I have hands. And indeed, we could escape Unger's skepticism by just reforming our language. We could just decide to stop using knowledge, the term knowledge, in this kind of absolute way. Right? It looks like if we reformed our language so that we got rid of these absolute terms, then we would no longer have any problem saying, well, actually, we do know that we have hands. And in fact, I imagine that there probably are already languages with sort of epistemic terms, sort of knowledge-like terms, to which Unger's arguments do not apply. I think there's a pretty good argument, actually, that the English language is already one of those. It really isn't at all obvious to me that Unger's arguments about the way the knowledge terms work is even in the ballpark of being right. But even if it is right, I think that it misses the point of skepticism. And it seems to me to miss the point of skepticism in kind of the same way that the externalist critique of skepticism misses the point of skepticism. And, it's because, look, what Unger's really offering us is some sort of account of, like, how the English language term knowledge works, or how the concept of knowledge works. And it's not really doing anything to induce doubt about these things we ordinarily believe. much the same way, the externalist just isn't doing anything to remove the doubt that reflection on skeptical scenarios induces. I mean, there's other views in philosophy on which almost all of our ordinary knowledge claims are false, but which we do not count as skeptical. We don't count them necessarily as skeptical views. So, take, for instance, eliminative materialists, like Paul Churchland, for instance. Well, if we think of knowledge as being justified true belief, what Churchland says is, well, you don't have any beliefs, so I guess you don't have any knowledge then. Now, I mean, obviously, eliminative materialists can offer alternative accounts of knowledge, but it may well turn out. So these are two things that could turn out to be true. It could turn out that, yeah, the term knowledge, the concept of knowledge, is actually connected to belief. It's about, you have to have beliefs. It's like connected in some deep way to folk psychology. And it might well turn out that eliminative materialism is true, in which case you just don't have any knowledge. And on this sort of view, it's like, well, would that establish skepticism? Like, if we were to establish that the term knowledge is part of folk psychology, and we were to establish that eliminative materialism is true, would that establish skepticism? I don't think it would. And I don't think it would because eliminative materialism, like on eliminative materialism, we don't really doubt a whole bunch of things about the world. I mean, for one thing, we're going to take the sciences very seriously. We're going to take neuroscience seriously. There's all sorts of claims about, brains and bodies and neurons and all these things that we just accept and we trust them. We, like the eliminative materialist, at least of the Churchland kind, trusts neuroscience. So it's not skeptical. Or take, for instance, mereological nihilists. Mereological nihilists argue that there are no composite objects. So there are no hands. So in fact, you do not know that you have hands. And the reason why you don't know that you have hands is because there are no hands. It's actually false that you have hands. And pretty much all of your claims about, ordinary objects around you turn out to be false. So, it looks like, at least when it comes to perception, yeah, I mean, the vast majority of the claims you make on the basis of perception turn out to be false. But again, we don't consider mereological nihilism to be a skeptical position. And I think the reason is because even though it's like the mereological nihilist is saying you don't have hands, they're not really doing anything to undermine the sort of trust that I have when I just open my eyes and look at these things here. Like, I still I trust them. I'm not really... I don't have any deep doubt of what's going on here. It just turns out that, okay, these aren't composite objects, but there's still particles arranged handwise, and that's close enough. I mean, what happens when you reflect on skeptical scenarios is you think you have this realization of, wait a minute, it might be that there's just not even anything that's anywhere near close enough. It's kind of like, it might be more like what happens when I just have a dream. When I'm dreaming at night and I take myself to be, part of like a whole world where there's, people and things and, there's like certain rooms and objects and etc. And then I wake up and that just disappears. Or at least it feels like it almost completely disappears. What's going on might just be totally different to what I'm expecting. But that's not what the mereological nihilist offers. Even though, again, technically, on mereological nihilism, it is not true that you know that you have hands. So I think that when we consider these sorts of cases, we can see, I think some appeal to thinking of skepticism not as a claim. It's not really about like knowledge and justification. What it's about is doubt or distrust, not taking certain things seriously. When I'm reflecting on the skeptical scenarios, I'm put into a state where I doubt that I have hands. I deeply doubt. It's not just like a little bit of doubt. There's like a deep doubt that I have hands. There's a distrust in the claim that I have hands. There's just a sense of, I really shouldn't be taking too seriously this stuff going on around me. And that, I see, is the is the sort of challenge that's posed by skepticism. Okay, well, I guess I've spoken about this for like half an hour now, so yeah, that's probably a good place to wrap it up. Anyway, I hope that was of some sort of interest, and yeah, I'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.